held virtually. And the questions being asked in advance of that meeting were, what momentum from COP26 we carry over into MEPC 77? That's what we'll discuss today. And at a more granular level, issues like market-based measures, life cycle emissions analysis, greenhouse gas intensity limit, and the progressive impact of carbon intensity indicator ratings from both a technical and contractual point of view. With that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Mark Smith. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for the great introduction there. So, first and foremost, we're going to kick this off with COP26. That was the start of the month, and it was quite influential in our opinion. There was quite a little bit of carryover from that into the maritime industry. So let's have a brief look of the influence of COP26 on shipping. Biofouling, first of all, it's an easy win. You know, we all know that keeping the ship's hull clean is going to be good for fuel consumption and therefore lower your CO2 emissions. Using a shoreside analogy, you know, you could almost say that driving a car with a flat tire is the same as using a ship with a fouled hull. But obviously, you have control over that as an owner, as a car owner, by pumping your tires up and choosing where you do that. But as a ship owner, you don't have that level of control sometimes because charterers will sometimes demand times at anchor and warm water stretches. So that sometimes has a negative impact. Nuclear alternatives were featured highly within COP26, and there's a little bit more demand for that. And we've recently published an article on molten salt reactors and the potential use in merchant shipping as we head into this next phase. So that's something that we suggest is considered and, you know, just something to look into for the future. The roadmap for green hydrogen, that's very important because at this moment in time, hydrogen production produced by fossil fuels is cheaper than hydrogen produced by non-fossil fuels, by renewable energy. And that's something which we'll see shift in the next 10 years. We imagine within the next decade, the price will come down of the renewable energy. And then we've got the Getting to Zero Coalition, which is another drive pushing towards zero carbon future in shipping. We've got green shipping cargo corridors, which is the Clydebank Declaration of Signatories, and this is maritime routes of zero carbon options between ports on a voluntary basis. Then we had the Glasgow Declaration, which outlines demands of more than 50 climate nations, including Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Latin America, the Middle East, and the Pacific. And then we have the phasing out of coal, which will not only have an influence on the industry, but it'll have an influence on trading patterns of vessels because many ship owners, you know, rely on trading of coal as a part of their pattern. So that's going to have an impact. And then we have the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which speaks for itself what that's looking to do in the near future. In addition to this, we have the Global Methane Pledge, which not only looks to reduce methane slip across the industry, there's many other points that it's looking to address. And that's something that Georgios will go into through the ABS classification part of the presentation. So MEPC 77, we spoke about COP26. Did MEPC 77 really deliver? Did it kick the can down the road as such, or was it just as we suspected? Anyway, our opinion is that, you know, there wasn't quite as much development as we hoped for, but nevertheless, there's room to make these changes within the next period. One of the problems we think is going to happen is that because not a lot's going to be announced till MEPC 78, it's going to push us into a tighter corner. And that's something that Georgios will talk about later as well. But it's not going to give ship owners much time between the middle of 2022 and the start of 2023 with respect to the carbon intensity indicator. So first of all, let's look at life cycle analysis. We're going to touch on that briefly. And really, we wanted to see more development there in MEPC 77. That's something that's been moved on to a later stage, but we'll talk about that and give a bit of a brief overview for those of you who are not familiar with the terms. The next point here, which we want to point to, is the revised proposals for the IMRB and the IMRF. This is an essential $5 billion research fund, which is very important for shipping in the future to decarbonize. And then we look at the midterm measures and revision of initial IMO strategy. That really wasn't as developed as we thought. We thought there might be more milestones for 2040 made in these decisions, but it didn't quite come to that yet. Pardon me. And then we've got the development of SEEMP guidelines and potential adoption at MEPC 78. We'll go into that in a few slides' time, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And then the important point is the development of draft guidelines on correction factors for certain ship types and operational profiles. We'll talk about that a little bit further on as well, but we just want to give you a quick overview at the start. So well to wake, we spoke about life cycle analysis, well to wake, and what really does that mean? Well, it's talking about measuring everything, the carbon from actually the oil well to the wake from the ship when the propeller actually propels the ship through the water. So what does that mean? And we've made this diagram to try and help explain this best. So at the moment, at this present moment in time, and for those of you watching the recording, you'll need to know that we're circling here the ships and the bunkering, and we're showing the wake there. So effectively at the moment, all we're doing is we're measuring the fuel basically from it being used in the tank to the vessel propelling through the sea. So that is a very minimal measurement of the carbon production. An example of this is, for example, if you look at hydrogen, hydrogen doesn't have any carbon atoms. But if it's produced using fossil fuels, then the whole process needs to be taken into consideration. So it's no use just saying the fuel has no carbon atoms when the whole process is actually carbon heavy. So when we look at the whole process here, you can see from the start here all the way along, this whole process needs to be taken into careful consideration. And this is where we measure it truly. This is what we need the industry to do. We need to move in this direction. And we note here that this is renewable energy. So we've got hydroelectric power here, we've got solar power, and we've got wind turbines. This is all feeding in because it's renewable energy. Now, the reason why the IMO is taking time to get to the correct place in this is because they're struggling to work out how to accurately measure the from actually the oil well to the tank itself. Obviously, there's many different variables here in the process, so it's quite a complicated method of measuring, but it really needs to be done to accurately move forward. Then we spoke before on the SEEMP, which is the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, and that's going to be finalised in more detail for MEPC 78, which will be in the middle of next year. The basic thought process here is that you plan the process, you implement it, you monitor it, you evaluate and you improve. And that's a constant process and a constant cycle that you need to go through to better and reduce the CO2 emissions of your ship. So then we look next. We spoke before, and we're not going to go into too much detail, but I'm just giving an overview here again about the carbon intensity indicator, the CII. And for those of you not familiar, it's not too dissimilar to a home appliance, a domestic appliance, such as a washing machine, where you've got an A indicating a higher rating and an E, which is an inferior rating. Obviously, you want to aim for the higher, the green rating, the A, and this will be promoted and favored by port and stakeholders across the industry. What the IMO has done is they've set a gradual target, which you can see here, which goes from 5 to 7 to 9 and then 11% reduction by 2026. And then more is to be decided once we get to 2026. The last thing I want to point out here is this formula at the bottom, which is used for the calculation of the CII. And the important thing to consider here is that distance traveled is factored in. Capacity is there, but not the cargo carried, remember. So capacity of the ship, but not the cargo carried. So that's not going to have an influence on it. But tankers, for example, which travel a less distance and use fuel to discharge their oil when they're near to port facilities, are obviously at a disadvantage compared to a container vessel, which is obviously trading a lot more and carrying through a lot more distance. So this is why at the moment there's correction factors going on. So what we're trying to do here is basically set the scene and explain why perhaps there is a little bit of trepidation, a few delays in the process, and why things aren't happening as quickly as we want. It looks easy from the outside, but when you consider all these correction factors and the consequences for ship owners, if this is done incorrectly, then I suppose we can understand why it doesn't all happen as quickly as we want it to. Nevertheless, we want to point out here, we want to point out again, and Georgios is going to go through this in his part of the presentation, but we really want to point out that this is pushing us into a corner here, because we're going to get into 2022 and there's not going to be much time before 2023 when the CII comes into force. So to finish off my part of the presentation, I just want to show you the Navigating Decarbonisation website. It's a website that's freely available to everybody with material there, signals, articles, and various documentation on various processes and new technology that's coming to the forefront. So please feel free to have a look at this. Please feel free to ask us any questions, and members also have access to recordings of these webinars if they ever want to refresh themselves. And we're always at the end of the phone or an email if you want to ask any questions. Now, with this point here, I'm going to hand over to ABS and Keegan Plaskin. And Keegan's going to say hello from the ABS office in the United States and take things from there. Thanks, Keegan.
Great, Mark. Thank you very much. As a matter of introduction, my name is Keegan Plaskin. I'm the Director of Business Development and Account Management for ABS here in North America. I'm very excited to introduce my colleague, Georgios Plervakis, who's our Global Head of Sustainability, is based in Greece, and will be leading our discussion this morning as we provide some highlights for you around not only the outcomes from COP26, but also certainly MEPC 77. I know that there's been a lot of developments and a lot of appetite to learn more about what's happening in this space, and we're very excited for Georgios to dive a little bit deeper into these near-term and more mid and long-term type of topics. Georgios.
Thank you, Keegan. Thanks, Mark. Thank you both for the introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm Georgios Plervakis, Director of Global Sustainability from ABS. And today we will be taking a short journey with an update on the developments that particularly had a particular impact on shipping from COP26. We will be discussing briefly what happened in MEPC 77. And we will also be looking at the emerging regional regulations, particularly on the EU side. We will also be providing a couple of case studies that will exhibit the impact those regulations are going to have on specific vessel segments. So we normally kick it off with this slide, where we present what we call the emerging landscape of decarbonization requirements. And it is a landscape because it has a lot of elements. It has a global regulatory piece. It has a regional aspect where you have regional regulations emerging, and you also have market initiatives that are actually driving now decarbonization. So what do we have what do we have ahead of us in the next decade as far as shipping is concerned? The first stop is in 2023, where we see the introduction of the short-term measures in the form of the EEXI and CII. Mark gave an overview of how the developments around those are now unfolding. We can think of EEXI as a technical filter where ships will have to go through and comply with a certain design index. And the vessels, after they go through, they will have to follow the downward trajectory of the carbon intensity indicator put in place by IMO, where it will take us to the envisioned reduction of 40% against 2008 values. When we're talking about 40% reduction, we mean a reduction of carbon intensity, that is CO2 emitted per transport work, per ton mile. But it's not the only requirement that ships will have to adhere to and comply to. There are also regional requirements now that are emerging. Particularly what you see on this slide is a decarbonization trajectory, a depiction of that. That slide, we call it, we have named it the Fit for 55. Parts of that bucket of measures will affect shipping, and it will apply more or less a decarbonization trajectory. We will talk a bit about these requirements later in this presentation. But it's not just regulations and measures that are now affecting how we strategize what do we do with shipping assets. It's also the market initiatives that are creating the drivers for that. We see Poseidon Principles financiers creating a decarbonization trajectory that ships will have to follow, and also charters. The Sea Cargo Charter has been rolled out almost a year ago, and it also creates a decarbonization trajectory. Now, in 2026, there is this MEPC that is going to take place, and it's going to revise the trajectories, the global regulator from a regulatory perspective. It will look back at what the impact was on this from the short-term measures on the overall strategy, and the intention is that we would have a revision. Now, the global regulatory landscape and the landscape of decarbonization requirements is what we have just mentioned. Let's take a first step and see what happened a couple of weeks ago in COP26 and how this actually relates to what ships will have to do and how this also impacts global regulations. Now, in this COP26 overview, we include the initiatives that have a direct impact on ships. A couple of days before COP26, we had the launching of the Cargo Owner Zero Emission Vessel Initiative, where 9 cargo owners were signatories to that, and the rolled this out in with an aim to lead the transition by decarbonizing their own maritime freight and agreeing to have zero emission vessels or vessels that use zero emission fuels until 2040. The most attentive reader would see that in the pledge that the signatories signed, there was some fine letters mainly defining what zero carbon fuels means. And to make also the link with Mark's presentation earlier, the zero carbon fuel for the Cargo Owner Zero Emission Vessel initiative is a fuel that is zero carbon from a life cycle perspective, so from a well-to-wake perspective. This opens the door to a multitude of carbon neutral fuels. What we don't have yet is a regulatory framework that can address that. I will mention that in a couple of slides later in the presentation. The second thing that happened was the Clydebank Declaration, which is actually what introduced the green corridors, and you have now 22 signatories agreeing to create green corridors between ports where there's going to be a framework of incentives in order to facilitate the establishment of partnerships and promote the use of carbon neutral and zero carbon footprint operations between the ports of those signatories. Last but not least, we have the Methane Pledge, where it was an agreement that started between the European Union and the States. And then during COP26, we had 100 signatories agreeing on that pledge. Essentially, it is an agreement, it is a pledge to reduce methane emissions by 30% until 2030, considering 2020 levels. Of course, when we're talking about the methane plates and the reduction of methane emissions, we don't specifically talk about shipping. The plates considers the entire value chain and the methane emissions that are generated through all the processes that are active in the value chain. However, shipping is part of that value chain, and it will be at some point impacted by the methane plates. However, one of the things that would also that methane plates also included were measures that would actually incentivize the rolling out and the scaling up of technologies that could support the reduction of methane, fugitive methane emissions across the value chain again, upstream, midstream, and downstream, as well as the framework to support the promotion of biomethane in that value chain. That is what happened in COP26 and had a particular, and will probably have a particular impact on shipping. But what were we expecting from the IMO side? Well, there was a lot of discussion during the intersessional working groups, the greenhouse gas correspondence groups, mainly 9 and 10, where we had a couple of proposals that found its way in MEPC, and we will see that in the next slide. The main idea is that we expected more clarity on the implementation and related calculations relevant to the EEXI and CII regulations, the short-term measures. And of course, we'd also expect the discussion around market-based measures and the life cycle approach on the fuel side to kick off during this MEPC in the form of the meter measures. These are how they are categorized. Taking that into consideration, what was actually submitted for discussion in MEPC was the development of the life cycle guidelines from the intersessional working group, the GH9. We had mainly two proposals, one coming from the European Union and one from a team of administrations supporting the introduction of certain guidelines to address the life cycle carbon footprint of fuels, the well-to-tank approach, as Mark also mentioned earlier. The other thing that came up as proposals from the intersessional working group Greenhouse Gas 10 was the introduction of a discussion around meter measures and mainly market-based measures. Measures that included a carbon levy, low carbon fuel standard, cap and trade, similar as we see now in the European side and with the ETS. One of the open questions that were raised during those intersessional working groups, the last one, the Greenhouse Gas 10, was the request of member states to address the review of the goals, the strategy more or less, and align that with the Paris Agreement and COP26. So what actually happened during MEPC 77, we did see the introduction of that proposal coming into MEPC 77, coming from Kiribati, Marshall Islands, and Solomon Islands. These proposals meant to align the overall strategy of IMO with COP26 and Paris Agreement, mainly looking at carbon neutral status in 2050 rather than a 50% reduction. What we have since last week is a lack of consensus on the zero emissions in 2050, so on that ambition, and a lack of consensus on the draft resolution. However, what we did have is a push for that discussion to happen in MEPC 78, so it's a bit earlier than what we initially expected. Remember that I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation that the expected revision of the strategy was supposed to happen in 2026. Now we're going to have to start the discussion earlier than that. So if we could say if we could mention one significant development since MEPC 77, that would be it. Unfortunately, As far as the short-term measures are concerned, the specific reduction exclusions and specific guidelines with regards to the implementation of EEXI and CII were not clarified. We have to wait until next MEPC so that we can have an agreement on those. So what we have is mainly what came up after MEPC 76 with the EEXI EPL calculation having now two different scenarios that we could look into. The non-overridable scenario with a 75% approach, and then the overridable scenario with an 83% approach. The overridable scenario also brings with it an average of 8% higher EPL, engine power limitation, for compliance with the EEXI requirements. At the same time, we also have the agreement for the CII reduction factors. Now we only have one scenario, and that will come into phases. We'll have the phase one with a 1% scenario starting from 2020. It has already started taking into consideration 2019 datasets from the IMO DCS up until 2023. That's when the second phase will start with a 2% reduction reduction factor on an annual basis until 2026. And that's where the expectation is that we're going to have an overview of the impact and the agreement on the next phases until the end of the decade. Now, we did discuss a bit about the mechanics, the impact on the global fleet. On the EEXI side, we see that almost the majority of the vessels, 8 out of 10 vessels, bulk carrier side, containers, tankers, and gas carrier side. The gas carrier side here in this particular category includes both LNG and other gas carriers. 9 out of 10 vessels will have to explore improvement options in order to comply with the EEXI regulation coming into force, as I mentioned earlier, on the 1st of January 2023, with implementation on the first annual intermediate or renewal survey, whichever comes first. Now, in the vast majority of those vessels that will have to explore improvement options, that improvement or that compliance with the requirement will come in the form of an engine power limitation. On the other hand, with the CII, we see also a similar impact where the majority of the global fleet will have to do some sort of an operational improvement in the form of, in the vast majority of the vessels, it will be in the form of speed optimization in order to remain below the required C rating, B, A, B, or C. Now, as we mentioned before, this is an operational measure, and it looks at how a vessel is operated. Of course, this would also be impacted by technical choices that are brought on board, energy efficiency technologies that can be retrofitted and included in the overall energy efficiency of the vessel. However, the challenge here is how to interact with the operational and commercial commitments that the vessel has. So how do you interact with the charterer so that you can remain constantly below the required line? And we will discuss a bit about that in presentation that will follow ours. Looking also at the impact these regulations will have, we have been asked to conduct several studies, and one of the studies that we did is looking at the global fleet and looking at how particular vessel segments like this overview of tankers will actually perform against the requirement. One thing that I'd like to highlight here, which is very, very interesting, is the fact that in certain segments like Aframaxes or LRs, we see that older tonnage, 10-year-old tonnage and above and older, might require a smaller EPL, a lower level EPL than younger tonnage, particularly the ones that are between 4 and 10 years old. That might be attributed to the fact that we had the introduction of the new tier, and therefore specific fuel oil consumption in this age group was actually increased. If we look now on the CII performance, what we have put in place is an overview of vessels based on the global fleet based on contractual date, and that black line identifies vessels that were built before and after the introduction of the Energy Efficiency Design Index. As far as bulk carriers is concerned, you see that there is a constant increase in efficiency after the introduction of EEDI. But another interesting thing is that you can see even before the introduction of EEDI, so pre-EEDI vessels, there are contractual years, where ships seem to perform better than others. And this is an overview of how vessels are going to be rated when the regulation is introduced in 2023. With container ships, we see that they will be more challenged than the other categories, the bulk carriers and tankers. You see that a vast majority of the container ships will be between C and E rating when this regulation kicks in, and particularly vessels that were built before, contracted before the introduction of EEDI. It appears that this group of vessels will be particularly challenged with the CII regulation. Tankers, again, they have a similar performance to bulk carriers. We see a constant increase in efficiency, and we also see that around the years before the introduction of EEDI, there were years where the vessels of those particular years will be a bit better than younger ones, depending on which contractual year you choose. Again, I emphasize this is how vessels are going to be expected to be rated after the introduction of the CII. Now, what happens on the regional side? The region that is moving fast with the decarbonization regulation is at this point in time the EU. We also see currently some very significant movement on the state side. The regulation that has already been announced and is now in development is the Fit for 55, with a lot of measures that are included in this package. We have included in this slide the four that we expect are going to have the biggest impact on shipping. Of course, we start with the emission trading system. Shipping is going to be introduced in the trading system of the European Union in 2022. That's the start year next year, in a month from now. The EU ETS is a trading system that the envisioned impact will be to incentivize energy efficiency, and more efficient operations. The Fuel EU will start from 2026, and the intention is that it will incentivize the adoption of low carbon and carbon neutral fuels. There's also the Energy Taxation Directive that complements the other two and will look into apply fuel levy. And last but not least, there's the deployment of alternative fuels infrastructure. This is a regulation meant to incentivize the scaling up and rolling out of port infrastructure that will have to be in place in order to support the whole transition. One key item here is the obligation of the major ports to have shore connection facilities, and passenger and cruise vessels to from 2030 onwards to connect those facilities whenever they are at port. But looking at this from those four, the ones that are focusing directly on ships, we have the EU ETS and the Fuel EU. The EU ETS will have the responsible entity related to that will be the party for the operation, responsible for the operation of the ship, which is, of course, governed by the ISM code. The geographical scope is what the EU has already in place for MRV. Rule of thumb is that 50% of that voyage will be incorporated in the ETS calculations, and it will come into phases. It will start, as I mentioned earlier, in 2022. That's the first reporting year, and then the submission of the allowances will happen in 2023. The vessels will have to submit on that first year 20% of their verified emissions in the form of allowances. Now, if one asks what is the CO2, the carbon price at this particular point in the EU, last time I checked was around 70 euros per ton of CO2. The second year, this will grow up to 45, third year 70, and then in 2026, we're going to have 100% of the emissions that are verified under the EU monitoring, reporting and verification scheme are going to have to be submitted in the form of allowances to the European Union. Now, there is also a scheme for non-compliance, as with MRV. If a vessel fails to comply for 2 consecutive years with the regulation, then it will not be allowed to enter European ports. The FuelEU comes in 2025, and it will actually introduce a greenhouse gas intensity requirement for each year of application of this regulation. It will start in 2025, and it will also have an increasing reduction factor for that particular required greenhouse gas intensity on an annual basis until we arrive to minus 75% in 2050. This is the first regulation that also introduces officially the well-to-tank and tank-to-weight components for the calculation of the greenhouse gas intensity. So if we take all of that into consideration, let's have a look at what the impact will be in the major vessel categories. One bulk carrier, we will see one tanker and one container ship. Starting with an example of a Kamsarmax, if you look at the CII performance of this Kamsarmax and start doing a sensitivity analysis around the selection of fuels, you see that this particular Kamsarmax will actually be rated C until, let's say, 2035 if it continues operation on VLSFO. If this vessel was running on LNG, then it will be able to have a range CII life, depending on what we currently know, and this is a tank-to-wake perspective. I have to underline that until 2040, so mid-40s. Methanol would also give it more extension as far as CII is concerned. It will actually extend its CII operation until 2040. That is when the vessel will have to explore some sort of an operational improvement in order to go again below the C rating. Now, on the European measure, the impact, what you see is that this particular vessel will start to accumulate allowances from 2023 to 2026, and that these allowances will amount to considerable amounts more if it was using it uses VLSFO. There's going to be less allowances that have to be submitted if it is using methanol or LNG. Now, an interesting thing here is what happens with FuelEU, and because FuelEU is using the life cycle and well-to-tank approach, well-to-wake approach, and this is considering only gray fuels, so fuels that have a fossil origin, like methanol. With the exception of LNG, all other options start to accrue penalties straight from the beginning of this regulation. LNG will actually take this vessel to 2035 before it starts paying penalties. The VLCC, we had a case with the VLCC, it's a phone scrubber that will actually, based on that particular fuel option, it will be able to sail until 2030, at the end of 2030s, before it has to explore some sort of a operational improvement. With LNG, there is this is extended to the late of that decade. And with methanol, again, you have an extension until the beginning of that decade, 2030, 2043. We see a similar impact also from the EU ETS, significant amounts. You see that it is this particular in 2026. This goes up to several hundreds thousand of euros. This is euros that have to be submitted in allowances. And we also see the same impact with on the fuel EU between the different selection of fuels, with LNG giving some sort of an extension to the time when this vessel will have to pay penalties. A 14,000 TEU container vessel. This particular vessel was significantly challenged, and it would have to explore operational improvements by the end of this decade. However, if it was running on LNG, you can see the difference that would be extended until more or less the end of the next decade. With methanol, that would actually take it to the mid-30s. And again, with ETS in 2026, until then, it will have accrued a significant amount of allowances to be submitted. And we also see a similar impact on the fuel EU with regards to the penalties that have to be paid for the operation under the EU fuel regulation. Thank you so much for your attention. Looking forward to receiving your questions, and I'm excited for the next presentation.
Thanks, Georgios, and thanks to Ian, Mark, and Keegan as well. Good afternoon to all of you, or good morning to those on the other side of midday. I'm Helen Barden, a senior solicitor in North's FD&D team, and part of our cross-departmental decarbonisation working group as well. So before turning to the carbon intensity regulations and Charterparty considerations as regards CII, I'll briefly touch upon the IMO Research Fund, the IMRF, which has been mentioned, and the market-based measure of a proposed greenhouse gas levy that's been kicked down the road to next year's MEPC for discussion. So with regards to the IMRF proposal, to be funded by collecting $2 per tonne of marine fuel consumed to raise the $5 billion for research and development. If we assume it ultimately does get approval, then it will depend on the point at which the $2 cost is applied and to which party as to whether a Charterparty clause will be necessary to reallocate the cost elsewhere. Similarly, with a greenhouse gas levy or emission trading system, if such market-based measures get approval, it will depend on how such a levy or ETS is regulated and who will have primary responsibility under the regulations as to whether a contractual provision will be needed to reallocate the cost. At present, there is no clear agreement on which global market-based measures will be preferred, or whether indeed it might be a combination of measures. There is a proposal from the Marshall and Solomon Islands for a carbon levy at $100 per tonne of CO2. And Norway has proposed an emission trading system combined with a fuel greenhouse gas intensity limit. Now, the International Chamber of Shipping and Intercargo did put forward a proposal as to how a global levy-based MBM could work. And in their proposal, a contribution is made on behalf of the ship to a climate fund. However, if any such proposal gets approval, how any final regulation is drafted obviously remains to be seen. And as I've mentioned, it'll depend upon who has primary responsibility for compliance under the regulations as to whether contractual provisions might be needed to reallocate that liability or that cost. And in fact, the ICS intercargo proposal does make the following comment. It says, in order to work within the enforceable legal framework of the MARPOL Convention, payment of the levy would need to be made on behalf of a ship. Nevertheless, the cost of the levy needs to be recovered from the entity that assumes the commercial operation of a ship, usually under a contractual agreement, such as a charter party contract, and is responsible thereby for purchasing and paying for the cost of the marine fuel. This needs to be made clear within any regulatory framework which is adopted for a global MBM. So, if such a proposal does get the go-ahead, it seems likely that a contractual clause will ultimately be needed to ensure that the ship owner has the right to recover the costs from the charterer, who under that proposal would be considered the responsible party. However, as discussions on these points were not progressed at MEPC 77, it does seem that we are some time away from actually being able to clarify such charter party drafting, or indeed from requiring such charter party provisions. So, moving on to the carbon intensity regulations and the contractual issues that arise as a result of changes to the vessel's operation. As Georgios has highlighted, some vessels will require improvement from the start to obtain a CII rating of at least C, and a high percentage of vessels will require an operational change or improvement by 2030 to achieve an A, B or C rating. For vessels where operational changes need to be made to be rated C the following year, operational changes such as speed optimization or reducing long stays might assist. Also, in some cases, operational changes like speed optimization might need to be combined with energy efficiency technologies in order to achieve or maintain a C rating. And even bolder steps might be needed to achieve an A or a B rating. Of course, it's obviously not commercial to just keep dropping the speed to achieve a required CII. The charterers obviously want to be able to operate the ship in a manner that suits them best. So as soon as we're looking at restricting how a vessel can be operated, then it's going to affect the rights and the obligations within the charter parties. However, while the primary obligation for compliance under the regulations is on the owners, given that the charterers have control of the vessel's employment, it's abundantly clear that charterers' cooperation will be required if the owners are to comply with the CII regulations. So another way of putting this is that both parties will likely need to succeed in some elements of a CII tug of war if the ship is to be traded commercially, but also the owners are going to be able to comply with the CII regulations. And I'll illustrate this with the help of our clever digital team who have put this slide together. So here we can see that the owners are pulling one way in terms of the ship's operation, and which will improve the vessel's carbon intensity for the purpose of the regulations. But such a way of operating may not be considered commercial by the charterers, who may want to trade the ship in such a way that does not impact so positively on the carbon intensity of the vessel, and so pulling in the other direction. You'll see from the animation that there are some actions that could help the owners to meet their required annual operational CII. However, you'll also see some matters that are going to require charterers' cooperation, such as having less time at anchor, for example. And others are going to cut across the charterer's use of the vessel, like going at a slower speed. And then there are other matters that are outside of the parties' control, such as weather conditions. So as you'll appreciate, the way in which charterers may want to or need to trade a vessel could impact upon the operational efficiencies that owners may want to take to comply with the CII regulations. On the point of compliance, there is sort of implicit understanding in the regulations that this means achieving a CII rating of C, albeit the regulations don't use the terminology compliance as such, but rather a required annual operational CII. Which will result in a C rating. That said, to get a rating of D for 1 year isn't exactly non-compliance, as it doesn't invoke immediate sanctions against owners, other than the requirement where the ship is rated D for 3 consecutive years that a corrective action plan needs to be put in place and the SEEMP updated. So in terms of Charterparty drafting and including provisions to enable owners to comply with the CII regulations, it's obviously not an easy balance to draw. Whether a requirement should be included to maintain a CII rating or a requirement not to exceed the required annual operational CII on a pro rata basis should be the yardstick for compliance, or perhaps an obligation to redeliver the ship with a particular rating. Those are all points for negotiation. Another point for consideration in a Charterparty perspective might be whether owners should actually have the right to refuse orders, which could stop the vessel achieving the required annual operational CII, or would mean dropping below a C rating for the following year. However, such a right might need to recognise the fact that the charterers can give an order which might be prejudicial for CII purposes at a particular time, but actually that could be offset at a later date by a more efficient order that is given by the charterers. What I think is very clear is that the collaboration and transparency of emissions data is going to be critical, and it's going to be required on a continual basis so that charterers can understand the impact of their orders on the vessel CII, and if necessary, understand the need for corrective action to be taken. A further point to be mindful of is the fact that the rating a ship has at any given time from 2024 onwards is the rating of the previous year, and is not actually reflective of how the ship has been trading or performing during that current year. So we understand that some charterers may, as part of their environmental and sustainability goals, seek to charter ships of only A or B or A to C ratings, even though how a ship is rated at the time of delivery isn't actually reflecting how the ship is operating up to that point during the current year. And so where the differences in higher rates between different rated ships emerges is something that also remains to be seen. I want to mention that BIMCO are currently working on a clause for CII for time charters, and I'm on the drafting committee for that clause. Due to the way in which the regulations are drafted and the commercial positions of both the owners and the charterers, and how to determine compliance from a charterer's perspective, it's not a straightforward clause to draft, but it's understood that there is industry pressure to get this clause out as soon as possible, so we are working to get that out as soon as possible. Finally, just to mention that I did speak in our webinar in June about some example BIMCO clauses that can help from an operational efficiency perspective, and I won't mention those clauses again, but just to say that there is a recording of that webinar available for those members that missed it, as Mark had mentioned earlier on. And with that, I will pass you back over to Mark. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen, Georgios, and Keegan, and Ian. All very interesting. We're now we've got a couple of questions there banking up, so we're going to take the presentation off. I'm going to take control. I'm going to stop presenting, and then if the panel could just make their videos onto the screen, please, just so we can answer any questions. Keegan, Helen, and Georgios, please, and if we could just. So the first question that came in, and it's a very good question, and what's the opinion on the Maersk announcement from Søren Skou? I'd imagine you're talking about the Søren Skou's made a recent announcement that he believes that the momentum from COP26 didn't quite carry through to the MEPC 77. And not only has Søren Skou made that announcement, but also the ICS have been quite vocal about it. Guy Platten as well has commented on the IMRF fund and how that's been quite slow. In my opinion, yeah, I'd like to see a bit quicker progress with the IMO. We're not going to say that for 1 minute. We definitely like to see more movement there. I'm going to pass that around to the rest of the panel just to see what everybody else thinks.
You have to point people, Mark, I think, to getting people speaking. Since I took that initiative, and maybe I can. One thing that yes, we do get a lot of that, and when I started this presentation, I was actually thinking whether I should say no news since last week. Is it good or bad news? In a way, it's not convenient news because we do not have the clarity that we need as far as the enforcement is concerned of and the application of these short-term measures are concerned. However, there was an interesting development with regards to the revision of the strategy. And of course, this it was proposed as a discussion topic for this MEPC during the GHG 10, and it was pushed for discussion in the next MEPC. This is something that is very interesting as a development. So effectively what happens is we're bringing the revision of the strategy closer to today.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. We did touch on that at the start. You know, something is better than nothing. You know, that's definite. You know, and that's definitely, you know, the overarching opinion here that, you know, it's better that some movement's been made than none at all. It's just, I think some parties would like to see a little bit quicker movement on that. If anybody else has got nothing else to say on that, we'll move on to the next question. I mean, I'll point that to you, George, just for the specifics, but the next question is more to do with the conventional fuels. And my understanding, please correct us if I'm wrong, but in 2025, there's going to be a 2% reduction, which then changes to 6% in 2030, and so on for the Fuel EU Maritime. So it's not like a switch is going to be flicked as such. It's going to be a gradual head towards zero carbon fuels, and it's not really going to be on an instant basis. But obviously, as emission trading schemes in the EU Fuel EU Maritime, for example, then obviously there may be a carbon trading factor there as well. So those prices are variable as well. But it's not going to be a switch. It's not like IMO 2020 where somebody's going to flick a switch and change over to lower sulfur fuel. So that's going to be gradual over time, just to answer that question. If you disagree, please comment. And then would anybody else, I'm not too sure, Helen, if you'd like to pick up on that last question, please. Sorry to throw you under the bus there, but yeah.
Yeah, so the standard clauses that BIMCO are drafting at the moment in relation to the EEXI, that's been drafted on the basis of a time charter. The idea around that is that owners are better placed to make modifications between voyage charters, and therefore there's not such a need to have a clause for voyage charters. As for CII, currently we're just working on a time charter clause. Whether there's going to be a clause for voyage charters, I'm not sure. I think it's easier for sort of express provisions to be put in, I suppose, in voyage charters, whereas in terms of a time charter, because the trade of the vessel is unknown to owners when they're chartering the vessel, there needs to be more cooperation between the owners and the charterers, and that's why at the moment we're focusing on the time charter clauses. Thanks.
Thanks, Helen. That's excellent. We did have a couple. I was going to open up some questions on carbon capture systems and wind powered assistance, but we've now come to the end of our time slot. I'm conscious that you know, some people, especially in Europe, for example, it's coming towards 6:30. So if anybody would like to hear a quick discussion on carbon capture and wind assisted power, then please make a comment or raise a thumb. If not, then we'll just close the webinar at this point, taking that we've taken an hour of everybody's time. If there is any more questions, please feel free to fire them into the chat, or alternatively, please feel free to reach out to us afterwards. As we've said, we'll be putting this into a PDF presentation. Anybody who's registered or came along to the event will be provided with that, and within that presentation you'll have the email addresses of everybody who was on the call today. So unless we hear any shouts otherwise, we'll give it another 30 seconds, and then I think we'll just let everybody say thank you. I'd like to say, first and foremost, thank you to each and every one of you for taking the time to come along, showing interest in this changing subject and evolving area, and thanks for your concentration and listening to what we've got to say. Thank you very much.